"I have been waiting to say this since autumn," Clyde Winslow said, and his voice broke on the last word like a branch snapping under the weight of too much ice. Wilhelmina Townsend stood in the doorway of the Rattlesnake Creek General Store with her back straight and her jaw tight, because if she let either one of those things go, she was going to fall apart completely, and she had not survived 4 months of secrets and cold and loneliness just to fall apart now. Winter was already almost over. She could hear it in the way the creek out back had started to move again beneath its crust of ice, could feel it in the way the afternoon light had shifted from white to something almost gold. Almost spring. And here he was, Clyde Winslow, the man who had said nothing since October, standing in front of her with his hat in his hands and snow melting in his dark hair, looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world. "You have been waiting," she said, and her voice was quiet and dangerous, the way a frozen river sounds when it starts to crack. "You have been waiting since autumn to say something to me, and in that entire time you said nothing. You let me think the worst. You let me believe every single terrible thing I invented in the dark, and you said nothing." "Mina," he started, "do not call me that." She stepped back from the doorway but did not let him in, and the cold air came through between them like a third person in the conversation. "You lost the right to call me that when you rode out of here in October and did not come back. You lost the right when I found out about Helena Marsh." The name landed between them like a thrown stone, and she watched something flinch behind his eyes. There it was. There was the secret, the forbidden thing, the dark past that had kept him silent all through those brutal months while she had stitched quilts and waited on customers and told herself every single day that she was fine, that she did not care, that a man like Clyde Winslow was not worth 1 drop of her attention or 1 minute of her sleep. She had lied to herself every single day. And now it was almost spring, and he was here, and he had something to say, and she was not sure she could bear to hear it. The story of how they had arrived at this frozen doorway on a February afternoon in 1883 was not a simple one. Nothing about Rattlesnake Creek, Wyoming territory, was simple. The town had been carved out of a grudging wilderness by people who were either very brave or very stupid, and after 6 years of settlement, most of the residents still could not say which category they fell into. The railroad had come through in 1879, which had brought the general store, the saloon, the church, the school, and eventually a small hotel. It had also brought trouble in the form of land speculation, which was how Cornelius Townsend had ended up losing everything and leaving his daughter behind. Wilhelmina Townsend had come to Rattlesnake Creek in June of 1882 to help her father manage the general store he had purchased with borrowed money. She was 24 years old, educated in St. Louis, and equipped with exactly the skills she needed to run a business: ledger work, inventory management, the ability to smile pleasantly at difficult people while mentally calculating exactly how much they owed, and exactly none of the skills she needed for Wyoming territory, which were an entirely different category of thing. She did not know how to read weather. She did not know how to handle a rifle. She did not know that a man who smiled at you over a counter of dry goods in June could become the most important and most confusing person in your life before summer was out. She had met Clyde Winslow on her 3rd day in Rattlesnake Creek. He had come into the store for rope and lamp oil and a paper sack of dried beans, and he had paid for all of it with exact change, which was rarer than it should have been in that particular town, and he had said thank you with a quiet sincerity that made her look up from the register to see if he meant it. He was tall, lean through the shoulders in the way of men who worked physically, but stayed hungry because cooking was less interesting than work, with dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite the mountains were made of. He wore a working man's clothes without a working man's carelessness, everything clean, everything mended with intention. He was 30 years old, she would later learn, though he carried it like a man who had spent those years thinking rather than simply surviving them. He had said thank you and looked at her with those dark eyes, and she had said you are welcome and looked back, and neither of them had looked away quite as quickly as they should have. He came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. And then, as July turned the prairie gold and the heat built in thick, shimmering walls above the grass, he started coming in on days that were not Tuesday, for things he could have bought the Tuesday before, and Wilhelmina, who was very good at numbers, noticed the pattern and kept her own counsel about it. Her father, Cornelius Townsend, noticed too. Cornelius was a big man gone soft at the edges, a dreamer with a salesman's warmth and an investor's optimism, and an accountant's complete disregard for his own financial statements. He had brought Wilhelmina to Wyoming because he genuinely believed the store would make them both wealthy, and he was so committed to this belief that he had missed several important signs suggesting it would not, including the fact that the railroad company had recently decided to route its next spur 40 miles to the south, which would take most of the future commerce with it. Wilhelmina had discovered this in the ledgers within her first week. She had not told her father yet because she was trying to think of a way to say it that would not break him. She was, in this respect, already carrying a secret of her own. But Cornelius had noticed Clyde Winslow and had approved, and had invited the man to Sunday supper in early August, which was how Wilhelmina first learned that Clyde ran a small cattle operation 8 miles north of town on land he had homesteaded himself, that he had come to Wyoming from Texas 6 years earlier, and that he was a man who listened to other people speak with the kind of attention that made you feel, for the duration of the conversation, like you were the most interesting person alive. She had sat across the supper table from him and been absolutely furious at how much she enjoyed it. They had talked about books. She had not expected that. She had brought 3 trunks from St. Louis, and one of them was entirely novels, and she had assumed that in Wyoming territory, where survival took up so much of a person's bandwidth, literature was a luxury nobody had time for. She had been wrong, at least about Clyde Winslow. He had read broadly, if not formally, whatever he could get his hands on, ordered from catalogs, borrowed from the schoolteacher, traded with travelers. He had opinions about these books that were sharp and specific and occasionally wrong, and disagreeing with him had been, to her considerable alarm, genuinely delightful. After supper he had helped her wash the dishes while her father fell asleep in the sitting room, which was something that happened with increasing frequency now that Cornelius was self-medicating his financial anxiety with bourbon, and they had stood side by side at the wash basin and talked about everything and nothing. And at the end of it, he had dried his hands on a cloth and said "Good night, Wilhelmina," like her name was something he had been saving up. She had stood in the kitchen for a long time after he left. August had been extraordinary. She had told herself she was being foolish, told herself that a woman in her position propping up a failing business, managing a father who was slowly losing his grip on reality, stranded in a town that was about to become significantly less important to anyone, had no business developing feelings for a homesteader with dark eyes and good manners. She had told herself all of this very sternly, and then had kept walking out to meet him when he came to the store, kept agreeing when he suggested she ride out to see the northern pasture where the wild grasses grew so tall you could lose a horse in them, kept sitting beside him at church on Sundays and noticing the way he smelled like clean soap and sunlight, and the particular honest mineral scent of someone who worked outdoors. He had held her hand exactly once in September when they were walking along the creek after a community gathering, and it had been accidental in the way that only the most deliberate things are accidental. They had both reached for the same fence post in the dark, and his hand had closed around hers instead, and he had not moved away, and neither had she, and they had stood there in the dark September air with the creek talking to itself, and the stars so close you could almost hear them burn, and she had thought, with absolute clarity, that she was in a great deal of trouble. He had not kissed her. He had not said anything significant. He had held her hand in the dark and then walked her home and said good night, and she had gone inside and pressed her back against the door and thought about what his silence meant. She had decided it meant he was being careful, being proper, that whatever was building between them was something he was tending to with the same patient attention he gave everything else. She had been wrong about that too. October had arrived like a door slamming shut. The first storms came early that year, which the old-timers in town said was a bad sign, and they were correct. Cornelius Townsend, faced at last with the inescapable arithmetic of his situation, had made a desperate gamble. He had borrowed against the store again, this time to buy into a mining claim south of town that a man named Gerald Purvis had assured him was full of silver. Wilhelmina had found the contract on his desk and had sat with it in her hands for a long time, feeling the specific terror of watching someone you love make an irreversible mistake too late to stop them. She had confronted her father. The conversation had been brutal in the particular way that loving arguments are brutal, full of truth spoken too loudly and history used as a weapon, and it had ended with her father taking the last of the store's operating capital and riding south with Gerald Purvis, and with Wilhelmina standing behind the counter of an empty store in October with winter on its way and no real idea how she was going to manage. She had not told Clyde Winslow any of this. She had wanted to. She had seen him the following Sunday, and he had looked at her with those careful dark eyes, and she had known he could tell something was wrong, and she had said nothing, because the humiliation of her situation, a woman who had done everything correctly, who had worked and planned and kept the books and been sensible, left destitute by someone else's recklessness, was a shame she did not know how to hand to another person. And then, before she could find the courage or the words, Helena Marsh had arrived in Rattlesnake Creek. Helena Marsh was 22 years old and strikingly beautiful in the way of women who know exactly what they have and how to use it. She had come to Wyoming from Denver on some matter of business that nobody could quite identify, and she had taken a room at the hotel, and within her first week, she had made it her business to speak to every eligible man in town with the focused attention of someone conducting an inventory. Wilhelmina had watched this from behind the counter of the general store and told herself she was not bothered. She had been bothered. And then she had seen Clyde Winslow's horse tied outside the hotel on a Thursday afternoon, and she had seen him come out of the hotel with Helena Marsh an hour later, and he had handed the woman up into a buggy with a careful courtesy that looked, from across the street, very much like the beginning of something. And Wilhelmina had turned back to her ledger and drawn a very clean line under the last column of figures, and told herself that she had never been anything but foolish. He had come to the store 2 days later on a Saturday, and she had served him with perfect politeness and told him nothing, and he had looked at her with something conflicted and urgent in his face, and she had looked back with nothing at all, and the conversation had been correct in every surface way and hollow straight through, and he had left, and she had not slept that night. And then, 3 days after that, he had ridden out of town heading north, and he had not come back. Not in October, with its early brutal storms. Not in November, when the snow came down so thick some days you could not see across the street. Not in December, with its killing cold that turned the world to iron. Not in January, when the wind came down off the mountains with a cruelty that felt personal. She had run the store alone. She had managed. Cornelius had written twice cheerful, vague letters that told her the mine was promising and that he would send money soon. No money had come. She had sold things from her own trunks, dresses she would not need in Wyoming, books she had already read twice, a silver-backed mirror that had been her mother's. She had kept the store open and kept herself fed, and kept every single feeling she had about Clyde Winslow locked in a room in her chest that she did not enter. She had heard, through the town's efficient and merciless gossip, that Helena Marsh had left Rattlesnake Creek in November. She had heard, through the same channel, that Helena Marsh's business in town had apparently involved a legal dispute over a parcel of land north of town, land that bordered the Winslow homestead. She had filed this information without drawing any conclusions from it, because drawing conclusions in the dark without evidence was how you made things up, and she was trying very hard not to make things up. But in the dark, late at night, when the store was cold and the wind was speaking in the walls, she had made things up anyway. She had constructed entire narratives around Helena Marsh and Clyde Winslow, each one worse than the last, each one featuring his silence as the most damning evidence. And now it was February, the last ugly stretch before spring, and he was standing in her doorway saying he had been waiting since autumn to say something, and the creek was starting to move beneath the ice, and she did not know if she could bear either the truth or the silence. "Come in or go away," she said finally. "I am not heating the outside." He came in. She went to the stove and put another piece of wood on it, not because she needed to, but because she needed something to do with her hands, and she heard him close the door behind him and set his hat on the counter. "Helena Marsh," he said, "I want to explain." "You do not owe me an explanation." She kept her back to him. There was nothing, you had every right to Mina," and he said it gently enough that she could not be angry about it. "Please let me finish. I have been trying to get back here for months. The pass north of my land came down in November, and I have been snowed in since then. I got through 3 days ago on a trail that took me 6 hours to break through chest-deep drifts, and I came straight here." She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the store looking at her with an expression she could not quite name, not desperation, not pleading, but something quieter and more contained. A man who had made a decision and arrived at it after great difficulty. "Helena Marsh," she said again. "Explain that part." "She came to town in October because she has a legal claim on a strip of land along my eastern border," he said. "Her grandfather homesteaded it in 1871, and the title got confused in the records. She came to dispute it. She talked to me because it was my land at issue." He paused. "I drove her to the land office in the county seat to show her the survey records. That was the afternoon you saw us." Wilhelmina said nothing. She was calculating. "When I left in October, I was heading to the county seat myself to get the title business sorted with the registrar before winter made travel impossible," he continued. "I thought I would be gone 2 weeks. The pass came down a week after I got home. Mina, I have been trapped on my own land for 3 months. I sent a letter in November with an eastbound traveler, but I could not know if it reached you." "No letter came," she said quietly. I know that. And I know what you must have, what you probably thought." He stopped. He looked at his hat on the counter, then back at her. "I want to say what I came to say. I want to say the thing I have been sitting with since October, since before October, honestly, and I know I have no right to ask you to hear it, not after all this time, not after what you must have believed about me. But I am asking anyway." The store was very quiet. Outside, the creek was beginning its slow resurrection. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bird was making a sound that was almost like spring. "Say it then," she said. He took a breath. "I am in love with you, Wilhelmina Townsend. I have been in love with you since August, since the night I came to supper and we talked about books and stood side by side in your father's kitchen, and I thought that whatever I had been building up here, whatever I had been working toward, it would only mean something if I was building it alongside someone. And I wanted that someone to be you." He paused. "I wanted to say it in October before I left. I should have said it in September. I should have said it in August at the fence post in the dark, when I held your hand and thought my heart was going to stop." Wilhelmina was gripping the edge of the counter. She was not going to cry. She had made a promise to herself a long time ago that she was not going to cry in front of another person unless the cause was genuinely catastrophic, and she was reassessing whether this qualified. "You were silent for so long," she said, and her voice was unsteady. "I thought I had invented the whole thing. I thought I had read something into nothing and made myself into a fool." "You did not invent anything." He took 2 steps toward her. "I was quiet because I was careful. I was careful because you are the kind of woman who deserves to be approached with intention and not impulse. And I wanted to be certain. I was ready to offer you something real and not just my feelings. And then everything got complicated with the land claim and the timing and the weather," and he stopped. "I have been sitting in a snowbound cabin for 3 months rehearsing this conversation, and I still cannot make it come out right." Something broke open in her chest. Not the bad kind of breaking, the kind you do when you have been holding your breath since October and someone finally says you can breathe. Clyde, she said, I know I have made a mess of this. I know you probably, Clyde. Stop talking. He stopped. She came around the counter. She crossed the store. She was shaking slightly, not from cold but from the effort of containing something that had been accumulating since August, since the fence post, since the kitchen, since the first time he had come into the store and said thank you like he meant it. She stopped one step in front of him, close enough to see the winter weather still in his face, the roughness of 3 months of isolated hard living, the dark eyes that were careful and warm and looking at her with everything he had just said still visible in them. I have been in love with you too, she said, since August, possibly since the first Tuesday you came back for things you did not need. He looked at her for one long quiet moment, and then he reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear with a gentleness that undid her entirely. I am sorry it took so long, he said. We have time now, she said. He kissed her. It was not the frantic sort of kiss born of desperation. Though there was 3 months of longing in it, it was deliberate, unhurried, the kind of kiss that is a beginning and knows itself to be one. She felt herself lean into it, felt his hand against the side of her face, felt the warmth of the store's small stove and the sound of the creek outside and the approaching footstep of spring, and she thought, here. This is where the story actually starts. They pulled back after a long moment and stood with their foreheads almost touching, breathing the same cold-end wood smoke air. There is something I need to tell you, she said. About the store. Tell me, he said simply. And so she did. She told him all of it, about her father's debt, about the railroad spur, about the mining claim and Gerald Purvis and the letters that promised money that never came. She told him about the dresses she had sold and the books and the mirror that had been her mother's. She told him about the long dark nights of that winter, the cold and the accounts that did not balance and the loneliness that she had refused to acknowledge even to herself, because acknowledging it would have made it too heavy to carry. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not flinch or look uncomfortable or begin calculating aloud, which she had been afraid he might do. He just listened with that complete, attending quality that had been one of the first things she had loved about him, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? He asked. She blinked. What? The store, your father, the debt. What do you want to do about it? What is your plan? Nobody had asked her that. She had been solving the problem alone for 4 months, and nobody had thought to ask her what she wanted, as if the fact that she was solving it meant she was a variable in the situation rather than the person at the center of it. I think the store can be saved, she said. I have been working on the inventory and the supplier agreements. If I renegotiate the credit terms with Hendricks and Cheyenne and bring in a few specialty goods that nobody else in town carries, medicines, quality fabrics, school supplies, since the school teacher has been complaining about shortages, I think I can turn a genuine profit by summer. The railroad situation is a problem, but people still need goods. They will just need to think of this as the regional source rather than a railway stop. He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. You have already figured this out. I have had a great deal of time. The debt to the bank is manageable if I make the summer profit. I think I can. She paused. I wrote to my father last month. I told him what I know about the mine. I told him that Gerald Purvis has a reputation in 3 territories for this kind of scheme, and that he needs to get out now and come home. He has not written back yet. Clyde was quiet again. Then, if you need backing for the inventory expansion, I have some savings set aside. Cattle had a good season in '82. She stiffened slightly. I'm not asking you for money. I know you are not asking. I am offering. There is a difference. He tilted his head. I would frame it as a business investment with proper terms if that makes it easier. I have reasons to want this store to succeed. The corner of his mouth moved. Personal reasons. She looked at him for a long moment. We are not engaged, she said. We kissed once. I am aware of that. The offer stands regardless. I will think about it, she said, which was more than she had expected to say. as a loan with interest. Properly documented. Whatever you want. There was a pause in which both of them became aware, slightly, of the absurdity of standing in a general store conducting business negotiations 10 minutes after their first kiss, and she laughed before she could stop herself, and the laugh was a real one from somewhere deep and relieved, and he smiled at it, a full smile, which was different from his usual contained three-quarter version, and it changed his face entirely. "Stay for supper," she said. "I make a creditable beef stew. I have been practicing." "I would like that," he said. The supper was, in fact, creditable. They sat at the small table in the back room behind the store, where Wilhelmina had been living since October, and they talked the way people do when they have been kept from talking for too long, not all at once but in a tumbling, overlapping, associative way, one subject leading to another, circling back, arriving somewhere unexpected. He told her about the winter on his homestead, the way the snow had come up to the eaves of the barn, the hours he had spent breaking ice in the water troughs every morning, the books he had reread because there was nothing else, the long evenings when the silence had been very loud. She told him about the store in winter, the particular quality of the days when no customers came, and she had organized and reorganized everything just to feel useful. The way she had taught herself to darn socks, because she kept wearing through the heels of hers and could not spare the cost of new ones. The letter she had written to a women's publication in Chicago about frontier commerce, and which had, to her complete surprise, been published. Bringing her a small check and several letters from other women in similar positions across the territory. "You published an article," he said. "A short one, nothing significant. Can I read it?" She got up and found it in the small desk in the corner, the clipping, worn at the folds from being read and reread by its author, who had needed the reminder that she was capable on the bad days. She handed it to him across the table. He read it carefully, the way he read everything. She watched his face. When he finished, he set it down and looked up and said, "You are remarkable, Wilhelmina." She had been called pretty and agreeable and sensible many times in her life. She had never, to her recollection, been called remarkable by anyone who said it as a plain statement of fact. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. After supper he helped her clear the table, and as they stood in the small kitchen area side by side, she thought about August, about another kitchen, about how long ago that felt and how near it was all at once. He dried the bowls and set them on the shelf, and she washed the pot, and outside the night had come down cold and clear, the way February nights do in Wyoming when the wind drops, and the stars through the small window were the kind that made you understand why people had always made stories out of them. "I should go," he said. "I am staying at the hotel tonight. My horse needs rest and so do I." "All right," she said. He put on his coat. He picked up his hat from the counter. He paused at the door. "Mina," she looked at him. "I am not going anywhere again," he said. "Not without telling you, not without making sure you know where I am and that I am coming back." She nodded. Her throat was doing something she did not quite trust. "Good night," he said. "Good night, Clyde." He left. She stood in the quiet store for a long time listening to the creak. He came back in the morning. He came every morning for the next week, arriving at the store early enough to help her open up and carry in whatever needed carrying, staying through the slow morning hours, helping with small repairs. She had been meaning to get to a warped door frame, a shelf that had pulled loose from the wall, a sticky drawer in the counter that had been jamming since December. He was good with his hands in the practical, matter-of-fact way of someone who had maintained his own property alone for years, working without fuss or the need for admiration, and she found it domestically startling how naturally he moved through her space, how he learned where things were kept and put them back in the right places. He brought her something on the fourth day, a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, set on the counter without ceremony. "What is this?" she said. "Open it." Inside was a book, a novel she had mentioned during supper on the first night, one she had read and loved in St. Louis, and had sold from her trunk in November when she needed the money. He had found a copy at the dry goods store in the county seat while he was there sorting out his land title. She held it and looked at it and was furious at how close she came to crying over a book. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything you say," he told her simply, as if this were not an extraordinary thing to admit, as if this were just the plain truth of how he operated. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that steady, warm attention. "I am falling more in love with you every day," she said, because it was true and because she had decided somewhere in the course of that long, cold winter that she was done not saying the true things. He came around the counter. He took both her hands. He held them the way he had held her hand at the fence post in September, with care and intention. "I intend to court you properly," he said. "I intended to start in October, and I intend to finish with a proposal if you will have me. I am putting you on notice." She laughed. "You are putting me on notice. You seem like a woman who appreciates advance information." "I do," she said. "I genuinely do." He kissed her forehead, which was somehow more intimate than the kiss of yesterday, and then he went back to fixing the shelf. March came in loud and warm, the way Wyoming marches do, not gently but in a rush, the snow retreating under a sun that had apparently been building its case all winter and was now prepared to make its argument decisively. The creek stopped pretending to be ice and became itself again, loud and cold and full of purpose. The grass began to show in patches where the south-facing slopes had caught the most sun. The birds came back, first the ones Wilhelmina could not name, and then, as the weeks passed, the meadowlarks, which made a sound that seemed specifically engineered to make you feel as if survival was worth it. Cornelius Townsend returned in mid-March. He arrived on the eastbound stage with considerably less money than he had left with, a sheepish expression that he was trying to hide behind hearty bluster, and a deep tan from the southern sun that looked incongruous with the Wyoming spring. Wilhelmina met the stage, watched her father climb down, and waited. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his bluster collapsed and he looked simply old and sorry. "I have made a terrible mess," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "You have." She hugged him anyway, because he was her father and she loved him even when he was catastrophically foolish, and because the winter had been long and she had missed him even when she was furious with him. "Hold on for a long time. Gerald Purvis," she said into his shoulder. "A scoundrel of the first order," her father agreed miserably. "There is no mine, there never was a mine. I know, I told you in November. You did tell me. I should have listened." He pulled back and looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. "The store is fine," she said. "I have expanded the inventory and renegotiated the credit terms. We turned a profit in February, small but genuine." He stared at her. "In February. Winter is when people need medicines and lamp oil and preserved foods, father. I built up those categories." Cornelius Townsend looked at his daughter for a long, quiet moment, and she could see him recalibrating something in himself. "You managed it," he said. "You managed the whole thing." "I did." She took his arm. "Come inside. I want to introduce you to someone." Clyde was in the store, having appointed himself the repairer of the back window frame, which had been letting in cold air since December. He came out front when he heard them and extended his hand to Cornelius, who looked from the hand to his daughter and then back to the hand with an expression that contained several things simultaneously. "Clyde Winslow," Cornelius said. "I have heard of you." "Good things, I hope," Clyde said. "Mostly." Cornelius shook his hand. He looked at Wilhelmina. "Mostly very good things, from several people in this town who have been watching my daughter be stubborn and excellent all winter, and who suggested in letters I have been receiving that there is a young man worth knowing." Wilhelmina looked at him. "Who has been writing to you?" "Mary Calloway, for one." "The postmistress." "Of course." Rattlesnake Creek's information infrastructure was more reliable than its roads. "We are courting," Wilhelmina said plainly, because she was done with ambiguity. "Clyde and I properly and with intention." Her father looked at Clyde again. There was a beat. "You will need to talk to me," Cornelius said, not unkindly. "I was planning to," Clyde said. "When the time comes." There was the particular male communication that happens in a look held for 2 seconds and then released, and Wilhelmina, who understood it perfectly well and found it slightly exasperating, let it go because some things were going to be what they were. April brought rain, which was its own kind of glory after the long, dry cold. The prairie went green so fast it looked like a decision, and the hills above town were covered in wildflowers by the middle of the month, small determined yellow and purple things that came up through last year's dead grass like they had been planning this since October. Wilhelmina walked out to see them with Clyde on a Sunday afternoon, the two of them on horseback, because he had spent March teaching her to ride properly, which was an experience that had included one fall, several moments of genuine frustration, and at least 3 occasions on which she had used language that would have shocked the ladies of her St. Louis congregation. She was not a natural rider. She was, however, extremely determined, and by the time April's flowers were out she could manage a competent working pace and had stopped gripping the saddle horn as if her life depended on it. They rode north toward his land. She had not seen the homestead yet, had heard it described, had formed mental images of it, but the real thing was different from any of her imaginings. The house was small and solid, built from timber he had felled himself, and fitted together with the careful precision that characterized everything he did. There was a barn in good repair, a kitchen garden that was just beginning to show its first determined green shoots, a view north toward the mountains that had no business being as beautiful as it was. He dismounted and helped her down, which she let him do not because she could not manage it herself, but because she liked the moment it created, his hands at her waist, the brief close proximity of it, the way he held on a half-second longer than strictly necessary. "What do you think?" he said. She looked at the house, she looked at the mountains. She looked at the kitchen garden and the barn and the particular quality of the light on the greening pasture where his cattle were beginning to move around with a recovered energy that matched the season. "I think it is exactly you," she said. He looked pleased by that. "Come inside. I want you to see the stove. I installed it last fall before the pass came down. It draws properly, which, out here, is not something to take for granted." The inside of the house was what she would have predicted from the outside: spare, clean, functional, with a surprising number of books, and a window in the main room that framed the northern mountains like a painting. The stove was, as advertised, excellent. She put her hand over it and felt the steady warmth. "You have been living out here alone for 6 years," she said. "Yes." "Is it lonely?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave most questions. "It was," he said. "For a long time it was just the work, and the work was enough. And then it wasn't, and I didn't know what to do about that. And then I met you." She turned from the stove and looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her stand in his kitchen, and his expression was unguarded in a way she did not often get to see, everything he felt about her visible in the simple geography of his face. "Clyde," she said. "Yes. I want to say something I have been thinking about." He waited. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying to say it correctly in the right moment at the right time, and I have decided the right moment is any moment I mean it, which is most of them now." She took a breath. "I want to build something with you. I am not just in love with the feeling of it. I am in love with the idea of building an actual life, the store and the land and the kitchen garden and the books, all of it together. Is that what you meant when you said you were putting me on notice?" He crossed the room. He stood in front of her and took her face in both hands with a gentleness that was its own kind of powerful. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly what I meant." He kissed her, and this time it was different from the first kiss in the store. It was warmer, fuller, the kiss of two people who were not introducing themselves to each other, but confirming something they had both already decided. He had talked to her father 2 weeks later, on a Sunday after church, the two men sitting on the bench outside the store while Wilhelmina pretended not to watch from the window. She could not hear the conversation. She watched its architecture, her father's initial serious expression, the way it shifted over 10 or 15 minutes into something that looked like genuine respect, the moment when Cornelius extended his hand, and Clyde shook it, and they both nodded. She stepped away from the window and went back to her inventory. Clyde came inside 15 minutes later. He looked at her with the calm that she had come to understand was his way of managing strong feelings, all of it contained under the surface. "Will you marry me?" he said without preamble, because he knew her well enough by now to know she did not need preamble. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He laughed, which was still somewhat rare and therefore wonderful, and then he kissed her over the counter amid the lamp oil and the dried beans and the specialty fabrics, and somewhere outside on the bench, Cornelius Townsend was probably pretending not to notice. They were married in June, exactly 1 year after Wilhelmina had first arrived in Rattlesnake Creek. The ceremony was in the little church on Main Street, which the congregation had recently whitewashed, so it looked optimistic in the summer sun. Mary Calloway, the postmistress, served as a witness and cried with a completeness that suggested she had been emotionally invested in this outcome since at least November. The schoolteacher, Agnes Whitmore, played the small organ. Cornelius walked his daughter down the aisle with a pride that had the quality of a man who has done less than he should have, and is grateful the story turned out well regardless. Wilhelmina wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself from fabric she had ordered from Hendricks in Cheyenne, with a small spray of the same yellow prairie flowers that had been blooming on the hills in April. She had pinned her dark hair up with care, and then let a few pieces of it come loose in the June heat, and when she came down the aisle and saw Clyde's face, the way he looked at her, full on and without any of his usual careful management, every feeling right there on the surface, she forgot for a moment that there were other people in the church. He had written his own vows, which she had not expected, and when he spoke them she understood for the first time what people meant when they said the ceremony was the thing that made it real. He said, "I promise to listen to you the way you deserve to be listened to. I promise to be honest even when it is difficult. I promise that if I ride out, I will always come back, and I will always tell you where I am going. I promise to build this life alongside you and not in front of you." She had memorized hers from a book of ceremony words she had borrowed from Agnes, but she departed from them at the end and said the true thing instead. "I promise to be honest about what I feel and what I need, which is something I have not always been good at. I promise to let you help me, which is something I am still learning. I promise to love you in October and January and February, and every season that comes after." He kissed her, and the church made a sound that was a combination of applause and weeping, and Mary Calloway achieved a level of emotional catharsis that she would speak of for years. The reception was held outside in the long summer evening, tables set up in the street, the whole town coming out in the way that only small towns fully commit to celebration. There was food that half the women in town had contributed: roasted meats and pickled vegetables, and 3 different pies, a butter cake that Agnes Whitmore had made from a recipe her mother had brought from Ohio. A fiddle player from the hotel played until past dark, and the dancing went on longer than was probably practical given that most of these people had livestock to tend in the morning. Wilhelmina danced with her husband. She was not a skilled dancer by frontier standards, which favored the energetic and geometric varieties she had not grown up with, but Clyde was patient about it, guiding her through the patterns with his hand warm at her back, and she found that with him she did not mind being a beginner at things. "Happy," he said, close to her ear under the fiddle and the voices. "Enormously," she said. "Good," he said. "Same." Later, when the celebration had wound down and the town had gone to its beds and they were walking up the road toward the homestead in the warm June dark, she held his hand and thought about October, about the fence post, about the moment she had held his hand in the dark and thought she was in trouble. She had been right. She had been in trouble in the best possible way, the kind that turned out to be the most important thing that ever happened to you. They settled into life at the homestead. Wilhelmina kept the store, riding into town 3 days a week, and managing it through a combination of her own presence and Cornelius's increasingly competent assistance, as her father had found, in the wreckage of his financial disaster, a kind of second chance at useful purpose. He was a good salesman, genuinely warm, genuinely interested in people, generous with time and conversation, and he was better at the business when Wilhelmina was running the numbers and he was running the human interaction. She expanded the store's inventory exactly as she had planned, adding a medicine section, proper patent medicines, and some genuine pharmaceutical preparations ordered from a supplier in Denver, and school supplies and quality fabrics that she sourced more carefully than the previous random assemblage. She brought in a small selection of books, ordered on a monthly basis from a distributor in Chicago, which became popular enough that she established a lending system for the ones that people wanted to read but could not afford to buy outright. The store turned a genuine profit in the summer of 1883. It turned a better one in the autumn. By the end of the year, the debt her father had incurred was significantly reduced, and the trajectory was clearly upward. Clyde's cattle operation had a good year as well. He was methodical about it, selective in ways that other ranchers in the area were not, choosing quality over quantity, maintaining his herd's health with a careful attention that paid off in animals that sold for better prices than the average. He had expanded his grazing slightly after the land title issue was resolved in his favor, which meant the spring and summer of 1883 saw the pastures full of healthy moving animals that represented something built slowly and correctly from nothing. He was, she learned over the months of their first year together, a man of very particular domestic habits and no bad ones. He rose early, worked steadily, cleaned up after himself without comment, as if the idea of leaving disorder for someone else had simply never occurred to him. He cooked adequately, not with her range of skill, but with a competence that expanded as she taught him things, and he learned readily, which was its own form of pleasure. He read in the evenings when the work was done, sitting in the chair by the window that framed the northern mountains, and she read across from him, and sometimes they talked about what they were reading, and sometimes they just sat in the same silence, which was an entirely different thing from the silence of being alone. She had not expected to love the homestead as much as she did. She had not, if she was honest, expected to love the physical work of it, the kitchen garden that she took over and expanded, learning as she went, making mistakes with the timing and the soil and the pests, and correcting them the following season with a stubbornness that Clyde found amusing, and then, when the garden became genuinely productive, impressive. She had not expected to love the particular quality of the mornings out here, away from town, when the light came over the eastern hills, and the world was very quiet, and the mountains to the north were clear and enormous and indifferent in a way that felt, somehow, companionable. In December of 1883, she told Clyde she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, on a cold morning, while the stove was heating up and the frost was still on the window glass. She said it plainly, as she said most things, and watched his face. He was very still for a moment. And then he crossed the kitchen and held her with both arms around her and his face in her hair, and he was silent for a long time, and she could feel from the way he was breathing that he was dealing with something very large. "Are you all right?" she said. "Yes." His voice was steady but rough at the edges. "I am more than all right. I am, Mina, this is the best thing you have ever told me." "Better than yes." She felt him smile against her hair. "Different from yes. Yes was the beginning. This is," he paused. "This is the middle, the good part." "The middle is usually the good part in books," she said. "We are going to need a bigger bookshelf," he said. She laughed, and he held her in the cold kitchen morning, and outside the mountains were white with early snow, and the creek was running low under its thin ice crust, and everything was contained and warm. Their son was born in August of 1884, a healthy, loud, emphatic baby who announced his arrival with the kind of conviction that suggested he had things to say about the delay. They named him Eli Cornelius Winslow, Eli, because Wilhelmina had always liked the clean sound of it, and Cornelius because her father, who had done better in the last year than in all the previous years combined and deserved some acknowledgement of that, wept with a dignity that surprised everyone who knew him. Cornelius Townsend had, in fact, made a remarkable recovery from the wreckage of his Gerald Purvis episode. He had sold his share of the store to Wilhelmina at a fair price. She had insisted on paying him for it, and he had insisted on giving her a generous discount, and they had argued about this in the affectionate, specific way of a father and daughter who understood each other very well and had taken up residence in town with a new purpose. He was writing, it turned out. Not accounts or business correspondence, but actual writing, a series of vivid, self-deprecating, funny pieces about his experience in the Wyoming territory that a small newspaper in Cheyenne had begun publishing, which had led to letters from readers and an expanding readership and a modest additional income, and most importantly to Cornelius, a sense of himself as someone who contributed something of value. "You should have been a writer from the beginning," Wilhelmina told him one Sunday. "I should have been many things," he said cheerfully, "but I am glad I ended up here." Eli Winslow grew up fast and loud, and full of an energetic curiosity that kept both his parents occupied in the manner of very small children who have decided the world is an experiment specifically designed for their investigation. He walked early, spoke early, had opinions about everything from the temperature of his food to the route they took into town, and was the particular delight and exhaustion of his parents in every way. Clyde was, as Wilhelmina had suspected he might be, an extraordinarily good father. He had the quality she had first noticed in the general store, that complete, attending attention, and he directed it toward Eli with a patience and warmth that was something to witness. He did not talk down to the child. He talked to him as if the child's perceptions were worth engaging with, which meant that Eli grew up treating his own thoughts as worth expressing, which created a talkative, confident, somewhat exhausting small person who was going to have a great deal to say about the world. She loved watching the two of them together. She loved the way Clyde would carry Eli on his shoulders to see the cattle, explaining things in a quiet, patient voice, and the way Eli would reach down and grab 2 fistfuls of his father's dark hair with complete trust. She loved Sunday evenings when the 3 of them were in the main room together, and Clyde was reading, and Eli was being told a story, and the fire was going and the mountains were dark outside the window, and the smallness and completeness of the life they had built together was simply, unmistakably real. The store continued to grow. By 1885, Wilhelmina had established a reliable relationship with 4 different suppliers, had expanded into a small pharmacy area with the addition of a formal medicines cabinet that required proper record-keeping, and which she had organized with the meticulous care she brought to all financial records, and had added a postal service component after Mary Calloway's increasing arthritis made the walk to her window difficult for some of the older town residents. The combination of services made the Townsend Winslow store, as it was still sometimes called, the most consistently useful building in Rattlesnake Creek, which meant it was also the most reliably profitable. She had become, over these years, a figure of some standing in the town, not the flashy kind of standing that came from social performance, but the quieter, more durable kind that came from being someone people could rely on. Women came to her with problems, financial ones, domestic ones, occasionally deeply personal ones, because she had a reputation for giving straight answers and for treating secrets with the discretion they deserved. She had helped 3 women in town navigate difficult situations with their husbands' debts. She had organized a subscription among the town's business owners to fund the repair of the school when its roof came in during the heavy winter of 1885. She had lobbied, with a careful and persistent correspondence, for an improvement to the road north of town that eventually happened 3 years after she started writing letters about it. Clyde watched all of this with pride, and with a particular expression she had come to love, the one that said, without words, that he found her as interesting now as he had in August of 1882, which was the thing she had been most afraid would not last, and which showed every sign of being permanent. They had a second child in 1886, a daughter they named Clara Ruth Winslow, and the household's energy shifted again to accommodate this new person who was, from the very beginning, entirely different from her brother. Where Eli had arrived loud and certain, Clara arrived in a considering quiet, looking at the world from her first days with an expression of deep assessment. Where Eli ran at everything, Clara watched first. Where Eli asked questions constantly, Clara stored her questions up and then asked them in clusters that were startlingly precise. Eli adored his sister with a big brother enthusiasm that needed only gentle management to become something genuinely useful. By the time Clara was 2 and Eli was nearly 4, the two of them had established a working relationship in which Eli provided most of the energy and Clara most of the strategy, which suggested they were going to be either very good friends or very effective partners in chaos, possibly both. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was one of the worst in Wyoming Territory's memory. Later it would be called the Big Die-Up, and across the territory it wiped out cattle herds at a catastrophic scale, a year of brutal cold following a year of drought, the grass short and dry going into winter, the snowstorms coming one after another without reprieve, temperatures falling to 40 below in the worst stretches. Ranchers who had pushed too hard in the good years lost everything. The territory's livestock economy broke apart and rearranged itself, and many of the large operations that had made men wealthy in the early 80s simply ceased to exist. Clyde had spent the autumn of 1886 doing what he had always done, being careful, choosing quality, maintaining a smaller herd than he could have pushed the land to support, cutting his hay stores earlier and storing them more comprehensively than seemed necessary to the more optimistic operations around him. He had worried about the winter. Wilhelmina had seen it in him through September and October, the weather watching, the calculation. He had not shared his worry completely, which she had noticed and called out. "You are not required to manage this alone," she said one evening in October, when she found him studying the sky for the third evening in a row. He turned from the window. "I am trying to figure out what we are facing. Tell me what you are thinking," he told her. He told her about the summer grass, the drought indicators, the way the animals were behaving, the temperature drops he had already seen earlier than usual. He told her what a bad winter would mean for their specific situation, and what he had done to prepare for it and what still worried him. She listened with the complete attention she had learned from watching him, and then she thought about it, and then she said, "What if we move 15 head into the barn in October instead of waiting for the first heavy storm? The hay stores can support it. And the wool blankets in the store, I can hold back a double stock for the homestead and sell the rest quickly in the next few weeks to customers while we still can." He looked at her. "That is good thinking. I have been listening to you talk about cattle and weather for 4 years, she said. Some of it has taken. They had managed the winter better than almost anyone in the county. They had lost 4 animals out of the 15 they brought into the barn, which, against the backdrop of ranches losing half or more of their herds, was nearly miraculous. They had emerged in March of 1887 with a reduced but intact operation, the store's inventory carefully managed through the worst of the supply disruptions, both children healthy, and the particular battle-hardened closeness of 2 people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side. Others had not been so fortunate. The aftermath of that winter changed Rattlesnake Creek, as it changed the whole territory. Ranchers who lost everything moved on. Some families left. The town's economic character shifted as the great open-range cattle operations died and smaller, more diversified farming and ranching operations took their place. The railroad, which had bypassed them in the big rush south, began to be discussed again as a potential connection to the new agricultural markets. Clyde had helped several of his neighbors in the aftermath, not with charity, which most of the independent men around him would have refused, but with practical assistance, advice, labor, fair loans with reasonable terms that he structured carefully enough that both parties could manage them. He had an instinct for how to offer help to people who needed it without diminishing them in the transaction, which was rarer than it should have been. By 1888, Rattlesnake Creek was smaller but more resilient than it had been in 1882, sorted by the hard seasons into the people who were going to stay, and the kind of people that staying in a place like that makes you. Wilhelmina's store was one of the anchors of that community. The Winslow homestead was another. Eli had started school in September of 1888, which he approached with the same loud conviction he brought to everything. His teacher, a young man from Ohio named Robert Farley who had come west with a teaching certificate and a collection of scientific texts that he was very eager to share, reported that Eli was extremely bright, extremely outspoken, and a significant influence on the behavior of the other students, mostly for good. Clara, who was 2 that autumn, showed early signs of having inherited her mother's facility with numbers. She could count to 20 by the time she was 2.5, and had developed a habit of organizing her toys by size and category that her parents found equally delightful and slightly unnerving in its precision. The letter came in November of 1888 from St. Louis. It was from her mother's sister, her Aunt Catherine, who had stayed in St. Louis when the rest of the family scattered, and who wrote with a careful formality that always made Wilhelmina feel slightly 12 years old. The letter said that Catherine was not well, that she was facing the winter with some uncertainty about her health, and that she wanted very much to see Wilhelmina before too long. She showed the letter to Clyde that evening. He read it. He set it down on the table. "How long since you have seen her?" "Since before I came to Wyoming, 6 years. You should go. It is not that simple. The children, the store, Eli and Clara can stay with your father in town. It is a school term for Eli, which he will survive. Your father can manage the store for 2 or 3 weeks with Mary Calloway's help, and I can ride in on the days your father needs an extra set of hands." He looked at her steadily. "Your aunt is ill, Mina. Go." She looked at him across the table. 6 years of him looking at her across tables, and it still had the capacity to stop her. "Will you come with me?" There was a beat. "The homestead can manage for 3 weeks. Robert Farley's brother is looking for work, Eli told me. He is good with animals. We could arrange it." She tilted her head. "I want you to see St. Louis. I want to show you where I came from. And I want to not make this trip alone." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was genuinely considering it rather than simply arranging his answer. "All right," he said. They went in December. It was the first time Wilhelmina had left Wyoming since she had arrived in 1882, and the train trip east was an experience of progressive reacquaintance with the world she had grown up in, the density of it, the noise, the way the buildings accumulated into cities, and the cities had layers of history and commerce that the frontier simply did not have yet. Clyde watched it all from the train window with the focused attention she recognized, storing observations, occasionally asking questions. St. Louis was exactly as she remembered it and completely different from how it felt in memory. The house on Lindell Avenue where her Aunt Catherine lived was tall and brick-fronted and full of the furniture and books and small accumulated objects of a long life lived in one place. Aunt Catherine herself was thinner than Wilhelmina remembered, and moved with a care that indicated something was genuinely wrong, though she refused to discuss the details of her illness with a stubbornness that was, Wilhelmina recognized, entirely familiar. She spent 10 days with her aunt. They really talked, the way people do when they sense the window of time may be limited about the family, about Wilhelmina's mother who had died when Wilhelmina was 12, about St. Louis and Wyoming, and what a life amounted to when you added it up. Aunt Catherine asked about the children and about Clyde with a sharp, interested attention that made clear she was assessing her niece's situation with care. "You are happy," she said one afternoon. It was a statement, not a question. "I am," Wilhelmina said, "more than I expected to be." "Your mother would be pleased," Catherine said. "Not just that you are happy, that you built it yourself." That is the kind of woman she was. Wilhelmina held this for a long time. Clyde had, meanwhile, done what she suspected he would do, made himself quietly useful, carrying things for her aunt, fixing the front steps that had become loose, spending an afternoon in conversation with Catherine's neighbor about crops, and whether in the way that he could have that conversation with anyone anywhere, because land and weather were the same language in any territory. He was careful and good in a strange city the way he was careful and good everywhere. And when she found the two of them, her aunt and her husband, sitting in the front parlor over a plate of Catherine's best biscuits and arguing about the merits of a particular Dickens novel, she stood in the doorway feeling something so full and warm that it required a moment to simply be felt. She caught Clyde's eye from the doorway. He looked at her with that direct, warm gaze and lifted the corner of his mouth, which was the contained version of the full smile, and she thought, "There you are." They came home to Wyoming in January of 1889. Eli greeted their return with a detailed account of everything that had happened in their absence, which took most of the evening and included several events of questionable verifiability. Clara, who had adapted to their absence with the philosophical pragmatism of a child, who had been extremely well cared for and simply got on with things, greeted them with a solemnity appropriate to the situation, and then requested that her mother read her 3 stories in a row, which Wilhelmina did, feeling the specific pleasure of being somewhere you are genuinely glad to be. The homestead in January was cold and quiet in the way she had come to love, the mountains white and enormous to the north, the snow-covered pasture clean and still, the house warm from the excellent stove, the books on the shelves, the 2 children in their beds, Clyde reading by the window. She stood in the main room and looked at all of it and thought about what her aunt had said. "You built it yourself." Well, she had helped build it. She and Clyde together, from the October silence and the February doorway, from the fence post and the supper table and the long winter she had carried alone, and the spring he had broken through the snow to get back to. They had built it equally and in partnership, which was the only way she had ever been willing to build anything. He looked up from his book. "You are doing the looking at things face," he said. "I am thinking," she said, about how unlikely all of this is." She gestured vaguely at the house, the window, him, the whole of it. "Unlikely. I came to Wyoming to help my father manage a failing store. You came to Wyoming from Texas to homestead land in the middle of nowhere. Neither of those things were meant to add up to this." He set the book down. He looked at her with the full direct attention that he had given her since August of 1882, unchanged by 7 years. "I think," he said, "that unlikely things are often the ones worth having." She came and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together looking at the northern window where the mountains were black shapes against a sky full of stars, and outside the night was Wyoming cold, and inside the fire was warm, and the children were asleep, and the creek was frozen but not silent. You could still hear it moving under the ice if you listened, still working its way toward spring. She thought about October, the way she always did in winter. About what he had carried in silence through those months and the cost of it to both of them, the time they had lost to bad timing and frozen passes and pride and fear. She did not regret it exactly. The hard road to a thing sometimes made the thing itself more real, more known, more yours. But she was glad the winter was behind them. All of them, the literal one and the figurative one, the cold silence between the fence post and the February doorway. "Clyde," she said. "I am glad you waited to say it." He looked at her. "What?" "Since autumn, I am glad you waited, because when you finally said it, you said it completely, no half measures." He was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you listened," he said, "after everything. I have always listened to you, even when I was furious." She leaned her head against his shoulder, especially when I was furious. He pressed his lips to her hair. I know. The years that came after that were not without difficulty. Nothing in Wyoming in that era was without difficulty. But they were full in the way that matters, packed with the ongoing work of real life lived with intention alongside someone who was, day by day, year by year, exactly who you had thought they were when you first paid attention. In 1890, Wyoming became a state, which Rattlesnake Creek celebrated with a gathering in the street that was smaller than the great celebrations of the bigger cities, but no less genuine for that. Wilhelmina marked the occasion by writing a piece for the Territorial Gazette about the role of women in frontier commerce, which was published with her full name, and which generated more letters than her first piece had, some admiring, some outraged, several from women who said reading it had changed something for them, which she considered more than sufficient. Cornelius Townsend, 63 years old and flourishing in his improbable late career as a writer of colorful frontier chronicles, had by this point published a small collection of his pieces in pamphlet form that sold well enough to be reprinted twice. He had become something of a local character, a man whose real story, the bad investment, the humbling, the recovery, was probably the most interesting thing he had ever done, and who had found the grace to tell it with honesty and wit. Eli Winslow at 6 was tall for his age, opinionated, interested in everything, and currently convinced that he wanted to be either a scientist or a cattle rancher when he grew up, and could not see why these should be mutually exclusive. His teacher, Mr. Farley, had given him a basic book on natural philosophy that he was working through with the intensity of a small person who has discovered that the world has a structure underneath its surface. He asked questions that made the adults in his life think before answering, which was either the sign of a great future or a very exhausting childhood, and probably both. Clara Winslow at 4 was already reading. Not being read to, she could be read to as well, but she was, without formal instruction, putting letters together into words with a determination that suggested she had decided this was something she needed to be able to do and had simply arranged it. Wilhelmina sat with her in the evenings and helped her work through it, and there was something in these sessions. The two of them bent over a page, Clara's finger moving under the words, her small face concentrated and serious, that Wilhelmina knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Clyde had, by 1890, established the homestead as one of the more respected smaller cattle operations in the county, not the largest, never the most dramatic, but consistently profitable and consistently well managed. He had developed a reputation for fair dealing that meant other ranchers sought his opinion when they were sorting through their own decisions, and he gave it with the same direct, careful honesty he gave everything. He had become, quietly and without intending to, a figure of some standing in the county's agricultural community. His voice at the Cattlemen's Association meetings carrying the particular weight of someone who had been right more often than he had been wrong. They were, in other words, exactly what they had promised to be at a whitewashed altar in June of 1883, a life built alongside each other, not in front of each other. The work divided not by rule but by capacity and interest and what needed doing. The decisions made together in the kitchen morning, over coffee that Wilhelmina had ordered from a Chicago supplier because she had opinions about coffee, at the table with its view of the kitchen garden, while the children ate their breakfast and the mountain stood to the north, and the world continued to be large and difficult and genuinely, surprisingly, worth it. On a morning in March of 1891, which was a warm one, the kind where the snow retreats fast and the mud comes and then, almost before you are ready for it, the first green, Wilhelmina stood at the kitchen window and looked at the pasture. The creek was running. She could hear it from here. The mountains to the north had lost some of their white. The kitchen garden was beginning to show the first tentative evidence of the seeds she had planted under glass in February, now ready to go into the ground. Clyde came in from the barn, stomping the mud off his boots at the door. "Pasture fence on the east side needs work," he said. "The frost heave got under the third post." "I know," she said. "I saw it yesterday." He looked at her. He was 42 years old, and the years were in his face now, the weather lines, the particular way the eyes of people who spend a great deal of time looking at distant things acquire a depth, but the dark eyes were the same, and the way he looked at her was the same. "You are doing the looking at things face again," he said. "March," she said. He came to stand beside her at the window. He understood this because he knew her, because they had been through March together 8 times now, and he knew what it meant to her, the returning of it, the way spring came back every year regardless. "I have something to tell you," she said. He was quiet. "Waiting, we are going to need a larger room," she said, a beat. Then Mina. "August, I think," she said, "or thereabouts." He turned from the window and looked at her with a fullness that was not different from the December of 1883, not reduced by 2 children and 8 years and a hard winter and 1,000 ordinary days. If anything, it was larger, more known, more complete. "Are you well?" he said first, because that was who he was. "Very," she said. He pulled her toward him and held her the same way he had in the kitchen in December of 1883, both arms, face in her hair, and she thought, here is the middle, the good part. She was right about the timing. Their third child arrived in September of 1891. Another boy, solid and loud and apparently in a hurry, born on a cool early autumn morning while the maples along the creek were just beginning to turn. They named him James, for Clyde's father, who had died in Texas when Clyde was young, and who came up in stories sometimes, described with the particular careful love of someone who had lost something important and carried it quietly. James Winslow was, from his earliest weeks, built like his father, long, steady, with dark eyes that watched the world from his blankets with a measuring gravity that made Eli, who visited his new brother with the enthusiasm of someone introduced to a fascinating new experiment, say with enormous satisfaction, "He looks like Papa." "He does," Wilhelmina agreed. Eli touched his brother's hand, and James curled his fingers around Eli's with the automatic grip of the very new, and Eli's face did something complicated and wide open that he would probably be too old for in another few years, and which she was glad she saw. Clara, who was 5 and fully in possession of the situation, had already begun teaching James things. The fact that he was 3 weeks old and could not yet focus his eyes was not, in Clara's estimation, a reason to delay his education. She was currently explaining to him the names and properties of the objects in the room, clearly and slowly, with a patience that was both more than her mother had expected and entirely consistent with who Clara was. Rattlesnake Creek in the autumn of 1891 was a town that had been through its hard years and come into a kind of weathered stability. The railroad spur that had been discussed since the mid-'80s was finally under real negotiation. The following year it would be confirmed, adding a freight connection that would change the economics of the area significantly. The school had been expanded. The town had a doctor now, young and recently trained, who had come from Philadelphia with his new wife, and an optimism about frontier medicine that Wilhelmina hoped would survive contact with Wyoming reality. There were 2 churches and a proper hotel and a bank and the general store, Townsend, Winslow and Company, which was the oldest continuously operating business in town. She had been offered, in the course of that year, the chance to join the board of the newly chartered county school district. She had accepted. She had also been approached about writing a more substantial piece, a regular column, for the Wyoming State Tribune in Cheyenne, and she had negotiated the terms with care and accepted that too, because she had things to say and the time to say them properly, and because her Aunt Catherine, who had died in the spring of 1890 with her hand in Wilhelmina's hand on her last visit east, had told her that the thing you are good at and the thing that matters to you are not always the same thing. And when they are, you should not be shy about it. The column ran twice monthly under the name W. Winslow, because she had a practical sense of how her words would land under a woman's full name versus a set of initials. And while the injustice of that calculation made her jaw tight every time she thought about it, she was interested in being read more than she was interested in making a point that came at the cost of her readers. She planned to make the point eventually, differently. In December of that year, Clyde found her at the desk after the children were in bed, working on her column. "What is it this month?" he said. "The school funding situation," she said. "The county has been underfunding the Eastern District schools for 4 years. I have the numbers." She turned to show him the column draft. He read it standing behind her, one hand on the back of her chair, leaning slightly to see the page. She could feel the warmth of him close, could hear his breathing change slightly when he got to the specific passage with the comparative budget figures. "That is damning," he said. "Yes, it is meant to be." He straightened. "The county commissioner is going to hate you. He already finds me inconvenient. Might as well give him a reason." Clyde's full smile, which she had been collecting since a kitchen in June of 1883, appeared for a moment. "You are remarkable, Wilhelmina. You have said that before. It remains accurate." She turned in her chair to look up at him. He was still smiling, just the corner of it now, and his dark eyes had that quality she had first noticed across a supper table in August of 1882, the full, warm, paying attention quality that she had never once in all the years since taken for granted. "Come to bed," he said. "You can finish tomorrow." She saved her place in the draft and put the pen down and stood up, and when she was standing he took her face in his hands with the same gentle precision of the February doorway in 1883, 8 years and 3 children and 1 hard winter and 1 very good life ago. "I love you," he said, "in case I have not said it recently." "You said it this morning," she pointed out. "I am saying it again." She leaned up and kissed him. Outside, the December wind was at the windows, and inside the house was warm, and the children were asleep, and the mountains to the north were there in the dark whether she could see them or not, and the creek was under its winter ice again, but moving, always moving toward the next spring and the one after that, and whatever those springs would bring. She thought about a February afternoon 9 years ago, about a doorway and a pair of dark eyes, and a voice that said, "I have been waiting to say this since autumn." She thought about what it had cost him to wait, and what it had cost her to be waited on, the long, cold silence of those months, the fear and the pride, and the invented stories in the dark. She thought about the creek, which had sounded like it was beginning to move on that afternoon, which had been the first sign that waiting was almost over. She thought about how some things take the exact amount of time they take, and how the arriving is better when you have genuinely earned the getting there. "Come on," she said, taking his hand, leading him down the hall past the closed doors of their sleeping children, into the bedroom where the curtains were drawn against the Wyoming December, into the quiet, warm center of the life they had built. The creek moved under the ice. The mountains held the dark. The stars burned close and enormous above the Wyoming plains, indifferent and magnificent, the way they had always been and would always be, over everything that was small and warm and human and briefly, brilliantly, perfectly alive beneath them. And in a house 8 miles north of Rattlesnake Creek in December of 1891, Clyde and Wilhelmina Winslow went to sleep as they did every night together, and home, and certain of each other in the way that only time and truth and the deliberate building of something real can make you certain. The creek kept moving. Spring was still months away, but it was coming. It was always, eventually, coming, and that was enough.